Hi, everyone. Welcome to the National Equine Conference call for the month of August. This is a joint call with the U.S. Animal Health Association Committee on Equine. And as such, I am going to turn this call over to Dr. Joe Fish, who is the Committee on Equine Chair, and he will facilitate all of the call today. There you go, Joe. Take it away.
All right, thank you, Katie. Thanks for everybody that is joining. We, like as Katie said, we are doing a conference call takeover for the Committee on Equine, part of the United States Animal Health Association. We've got a packed lineup for you today. And at the end we're going to go over a couple resolutions and give you a brief Florida CEM update if time allows. But our two primary presenters are Dr. Sally Donata from the University of Florida College of Veterinary Medicine and Dr. Angela Pelzel-McCluskey from the United States Department of Ag. Thanks everybody for jumping on. If you are interested in joining the Committee on Equine, we've got a lot of fun stuff cooking. We are working on a big update to the EHM guidance document. We've been working through that, so really appreciate all the help from both the laboratory side and the developmental production side, and then state animal health official side. So good working group there. If you have interest, please let me know, and we'll get you added to that. We hold the call. It's on a Monday. It's usually either the last Monday of the month or the next to last Monday of the month, depending on how that goes. It's for an hour and a half. It's usually around 1 p.m. to 2:30, and that's Eastern time. So let me know if you're interested in that. And if you have any additional ideas for resolutions, then you can talk to me about that after the call as well. But in the interim, Dr. Pelzel-McCluskey is going to talk to us on smuggled horses. Take it away.
Okay, Joe, I'm going to work on sharing my screen here. I always love it when all of our equine friends get together on a call like this. That's always pretty fun. I was asked to bring you a topic that I got some questions about in last month's National Equine Conference call, because we had Dr. Brian Bowl on talking about some of the EIA and Puro positives that Texas had been finding recently. And I got a lot of comments saying, oh my gosh, this all of a sudden is a problem. And it's like, no, this is a daily problem. This is absolutely a daily problem, not just in Texas, but in some of our other border states as well. So, Joe, thanks so much for this suggestion to maybe bring some information about smuggled horses and what we're seeing, what the risks are, what these really are. So I named this kind of funny, how did that get here? That's usually the question I have in my mind almost every day in my job. So this is kind of the story of illegal movement of horses into the U.S. And this has been at this volume, honestly, for at least the past, 5 or 6 years minimum, but this has always been a problem for us. So long term, our border with Mexico is, a really controversial issue for a lot of different reasons, right? But for those of us on this call, equine health is really important, and that border is a serious hole for us that is not going to be mitigated any better than what we're doing right now. And we'll talk about why here in a minute. But overall, we have endemic diseases in Mexico that either we shouldn't have here in the U.S., such as equine paroplasmosis, or that we have nearly eradicated in the U.S., like equine infectious anemia. So that's always a constant source of pressure, disease pressure from the south coming at us. Also, I don't want to forget about ticks, because, both of our cattle fever ticks are fully present in Mexico, and in the United States, we have pushed Buophilus microplex and Buophilus annulatus south. towards the Mexican border where we maintain a permanent quarantine zone there. But they're rampant in Mexico, and there are other tick species that we don't have on this side and certainly don't want, along with any diseases that those can carry. And finally, it's not just the disease status of Mexico that's a problem for us. We are seeing a lot of horses from other regions of the world that are coming to Mexico and are being smuggled across because they have buyers here in the US. The US has a lot of money to spend on horses. We have certain types of horses that we purchase, that we are a primary purchaser for. And so we have people around the world that are trying to get those horses to buyers in the United States through Mexico illegally. So it's not just the disease status of Mexico, it's a disease status of all these other countries that may skip into Mexico with, either different entry requirements or no entry requirements for certain diseases that we may care about, and then are smuggled across. So we're going to talk about all of that situation today. How do you legally get a horse from Mexico and the US? This is the process that's supposed to happen. So for a legal importation, we need an international health certificate endorsed by the Mexican animal health officials with the exam performed by a Mexican veterinarian certifying the health status of the horse. So that's a normal health certificate, international health certificate. Currently, Mexico is a 7-day quarantine country. They have had cases in the last few years of VEE, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, that makes them a 7-day import country. Screwworm affected countries are also 7-day import, whereas all of our other countries are a 3-day import quarantine. So the 7-day import quarantine, the horses are going to stand there in our official southern border port location, and they're going to undergo physical examination and daily monitoring by a USDA APHIS veterinarian who's watch them for clinical signs of anything. They're examined and they're spray dipped for ticks. We're mainly looking for cattle fever ticks, but we're getting all other types of ticks as well. And finally, you guys, I think, know this, they're tested for our 4 import diseases of concern. So that's Dorine, glanders, both types of pyroplasmosis, and EIA. At any point, an equid that fails any of these items on the checklist, including testing positive or non-negative for any one of our import diseases, they're going to be rejected from import quarantine. And we currently have an all-in, all-out status. So all of the cohorts for a disease positive horse are also going to be rejected, anything determined to be a cohort. So that is the legal process of how this happens. But I think you guys know that, we don't have southern border ports continuously across our border, nor do we have a lot of real physical barriers for their entry. So I get asked this question a lot. I'm a native Texan, so this is obvious to me, but how are horses smuggled physically from Mexico? And the answer is, y'all, the Rio Grande is not that grande. Okay, that is the main problem here. Our international border in most places is a very thin line that folks and horses can walk across. So just to give you some examples of that, we also have things like this that occur in hundreds of places along the Rio Grande. We have these sorts of sandbars and other natural features where we have shallow water and slowing of water. And I mean, you can see there's no fences on either side. So on the top here is the United States, on the bottom is Mexico, and anyone can just come along this road, walk a horse across, continue it on the sandbar. And you can see in the top right-hand corner, we have roads and communities and pastures and facilities right there along the border with Mexico. And so these are places where horses are walked across and either loaded up and moved. They're prearranged with other folks on this side that have trucks and trailers that will haul them. Or in some cases, we have facilities that are right on the other side where the horses are dropped into a pasture with a lean-to and some water, and someone else will come the next day and fetch them out of that pasture and take them on to their destination in the US. So this occurs in any of our southern border states. You guys know we do not have a Great Wall of China along our south, and this is a daily occurrence for horses, humans, drugs, guns, you name it. I think you all know this story. So what types of horses are actually being smuggled? We have some key groups that I want you to watch out for. I think you know some of this story, right? We talk a lot about quarter horse racehorses and bush track or unsanctioned racing, but I want you to know that these are moving daily back and forth. Quarter horse racehorses, both for sanctioned racing and for unsanctioned racing, are being moved illegally just because the owners and trainers consider that to be how you normally move a horse. They don't bother with import quarantine. They don't present the horses for official entry in most cases. They just walk them over. They arrange to have them here and here. And this is where we find a lot of our disease cases. So this guy on the upper right, this is Remembering Spence. We found him EIA positive in New Mexico several years back. He was so close to the border that they actually escaped with him over the border overnight while we were trying to get him quarantined and locked up. And I found him 2 years later infected with EIA still in Colorado, and he was now dually infected with piroplasmosis when we found him a couple of years ago in Colorado. So when they escape, they usually do come back, and we usually do find them eventually, but it takes time. And in the intervening years, he acquired a different infection, EIA and Piro on top of that. This bottom horse from Oklahoma was one we found, I think, last year or the year before. You know, she doesn't look to be in good condition because she actually came across just a few weeks prior. But you can see, if you look closely in the mud, she has brand new racing plates on. They smuggled her over here to bush track her. And so when we found her EIA positive, she was also piroplasmosis positive. She was a dual reactor. She was being tested to get onto racetracks. And you know, that's kind of the story of how we find some of these. And then this top left one from New Mexico, this is a horse that is actually missing. I'm still actively looking for this horse. This is an EIA positive we found in New Mexico a couple years ago. They smuggled it back across the border with Mexico to save it from being euthanized. They actually faked this horse's death to convince us that the horse had died. They put a opaque fly mask over the horse and laid it down and took a photo. But there's still a lead rope attached to the horse with somebody holding the lead rope. Okay, if the horse is dead, you don't need to hold on to the lead rope anymore, right? The horse was definitely alive and laid down to pose as if it were dead. But I know this horse is still out there, either in Mexico or now somewhere in the US. So both sanctioned and unsanctioned quarter horse racehorses, despite their risk factors being in the racing and the iatrogenic transmission of these diseases itself, they're also being exposed naturally by coming back and forth illegally to and from Mexico. Current events just this week on Monday, this top left horse was confirmed EIA positive in New Mexico. She's a 2-year-old racing quarter horse filly that has no sanctioned race career. And she was moved directly across the border to this training facility just in the last week or two. When we found her positive, she was being tested to enter Sunland Park to enter a sanctioned race. And we tested her cohorts, and all 3 of these guys just yesterday were confirmed EIA positive. This one on the lower left is also a 2-year-old filly, no sanctioned race history. You can see they're fit, they're ready to race. They have been racing in Mexico. And these were walked across to get to where they are. And I can tell you how they were walked across. So this is a training facility in New Mexico where those 4 horses are currently stabled. I don't know if you can really see this, but on the left-hand side, there's this kind of murky green line. This murky green line is actually the Rio Grande River. You can see again, my point, the Rio Grande is not that grande. So routinely, I get horses that are walked across right about here. You can see they have a trail where they come across. They drive in, they unload them on the Mexican side, they walk them across the river, they walk to this training center, and they appear overnight in stalls in this training center for both sanctioned and unsanctioned racing. And then they disappear just the same way. So this is a facility where I've lost several EIA and piroplasmosis positives in the night. And some of them I'm still looking for. So that's bush track and sanctioned quarter horse racehorses are moving illegally back and forth to do their job. And we're also getting a different kind of horse. Well-broke saddle horses from Mexico are a very popular type of horse that are smuggled across into the US. Again, these are well-broke horses. They have buyers in the United States that will pay top dollar for broke saddle horses, and they're usually kind of flashy. This little guy we found in March of 2023 in Texas. He's EIA positive, and he's kind of a rotund kid's large pony. And so 4-H horses, pony horses, rope horses, any kind of well-broke saddle horse we've found these types of horses positive for either EIA or piroplasmosis on this side. And when we trace them back, they have no record of legal entry, and they did originate in Mexico. So that's another group of horses to look out for. Here's a few more pictures of these. When I have pictures, I try to get them to you so you can see what we're up against. These are, again, usually flashy, well-broke horses. This Palomino on the left and this little brown guy on the lower right are both dual infected with EIA and piroplasmosis, and were found positive on this side of the line. With people who had nothing to do with how the horse entered. These are second, third, fourth buyers that have ended up with the horse. They test the horse to either go to a show or event or a competition or whatever. And that's when we uncover what they're carrying for diseases and what has happened to bring them to this side of the line. Here's a couple just from a couple months ago in June. We had a set of 4 horses that were intercepted in the act of being smuggled across the border in Texas, and 2 of the 4 were piroplasmosis positive. This one just looks like a saddle horse gelding, and this guy is actually an intact stallion. He's obviously a riding horse. I don't know if he's a Charo horse. He kind of looks a bit Charo type to me, but these are horses that were destined for people here on the US side. So Charo horses are another group of horses that we routinely see infected with Piro, EIA, or both, and sometimes originate as smuggled horses when we investigate them. So here's just some recent examples. The 2 grays are Piro infected. The top more mottled darker gray, the younger horse here, was a horse found EIA positive in Texas, and he was destined for Florida at the time that he was tested. So these go far and wide. They don't stay in our border states. And then this Frisian guy was intercepted. He was actually not infected with anything, but he was intercepted with another Frisian and some other saddle horses. The Charo event horses do a lot of different events. So this is Mexican rodeo. The Andalusians, the Lusitanos, and the Frisians are usually dancing horses. So they prance as part of their competition, but we also have trick rope horses and sliding horses that do Charo events as well that may originate in Mexico, or like this this gray guy on the right in full Charo gear. He actually originated in Costa Rica, which is where he acquired his piroplasmosis infection. So this is another category of horses to look for that have high risk of potentially being smuggled from Mexico. Here's another category for you, and this one kind of hits close to home for our US EF friends. Sport horses are a huge commodity being smuggled from Mexico to buyers in the US for large sums of money. So I'm going to direct your attention to these 3 on the right. Those 3 horses were found all piroplasmosis positive while being high-level competitors in US EF events. The one on the top right, the dressage horse, actually originated in Spain. This gray horse on the bottom, unfortunately, was one of our Tokyo Paralympic horses that was being tested for piroplasmosis to go to the games. We did sign waivers and get him to the games, but he now cannot return home because he's still piro-infected. I believe they're trying to treat him in Germany to try to get him home. The buyer on the top right with the dressage horse was involved in the horse entering illegally via Mexico, or again, originating in Spain, and she was fined for her involvement in that movement. But these folks here with our Paralympic horse had no involvement at all in how the horse entered the US. And he entered and crossed somewhere from Baja into California years ago and has been competing here ever since. The horse in Texas, the Hunter Jumper, he actually originated in Belgium and was a known EP infected horse. His stablemate was an EP negative horse that they both sold to the United States at the same time. The negative horse was actually shipped correctly by plane to JFK in New York and entered legally. And they knew that this horse was EP infected. And so they sent him a different way. He came to Mexico, and then we believe he was smuggled across. At that point, there is no official record of his entry or presentation for import. And then these other two, Lusitano up at the top, found in Washington State, and this Frisian that was intercepted in the act of being smuggled in Texas. You know, these are sport horse prospects. We don't know where they were eventually destined or what they were intended to do, but my point to you is that sport horse types that have buyers here in the US are being smuggled frequently, and they are usually being smuggled because they carry a disease where folks know they will not pass our importation tests. So some ongoing challenges we have here. This is a constant and ongoing risk. This is a daily thing. I think for some of our non-border states, folks may not recognize that these movements are frequent and daily. We have some significant issues with how to address this because livestock movement illegally across the border is in a significantly lower tier concern for law enforcement. And rightly so, right? The people, the narcotics, and the weapons that are moving illegally across the border are of greater risk to the overall population in the US. And so those activities are prioritized over illegal smuggling of livestock, right? So I don't think we'll ever change this tier. We've done a really good job with partnerships on the border and communication pathways with many different entities that patrol the border, both state and federal, and have law enforcement activities. And so we're going to continue, I think, to try to improve those communications so that they know on the animal health side, we are looking for and we need interception of not only smuggled live animals, but also smuggled products such as semen. Equine semen has been a frequently smuggled product that we've encountered as well, usually in the cab of the truck with the guy who's pulling the trailer with the horses he just smuggled. So both horses and products are a problem, and continuing these partnerships and communication pathways so that when something is seen, we on the animal health side can be alerted and can respond to that activity will really help us, because we're never going to trump the people or the narcotics or the weapons that are of larger risk for movement. I think from our animal health side as veterinarians, we really need to increase the awareness of US veterinarians handling horses, that they may be the first person to encounter an equid that was moved into the United States illegally. They may be the first place where this horse is actually visualized and seen and evaluated for how it entered. So, you know, I try to get the message out, but I think we all need to work together to continue this messaging that for equine veterinarians that encounter a horse that's reported to be a previous import, or perhaps is one of these types of populations that I described earlier, but has a murky origin history, or perhaps the current owner doesn't know how the horse came to be here. Any of those scenarios, if the owner doesn't know how the horse entered the country, then we really want our veterinarians to consider testing these high-risk horses for Puro and EIA for sure. And if it's a stallion, I would suggest CEM is on the list as well, because horses that are being presented, even legally, for entry from Mexico are coming from a CEM-free country. And so they're not required to do our CEM testing in the US. And we do have horses that are specifically circumventing our CEM testing by presenting through Mexico. And these are horses coming from European nations and other CEM affected regions. And it's a big risk for us. So we have to really, I think in the future, get the message out to veterinarians who are seeing these horses about what types of horses or what backstory might be at risk for this type of illegal movement, and then also inform them of the diseases of concern that are very likely to be a problem in that particular horse, and what kind of testing to do to actually get to the bottom of whether or not that horse is safe for their client, or whether we have a problem we need to deal with. This is my Frisian sport horse. I do have absolute proof he was born in Missouri, so never transited illegally from Mexico. My contact information is here, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions, either offline if you want to contact me or on this call. So Joe, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you. We probably have time for one question. I've been very proactively muting everybody, so everybody else has good listening pleasure. You will need to take yourself off mute if you want to ask a question.
I've probably stunned people into submission because
I love it.
It's a frustrating problem that has no clear solution, right?
Hey, Angela, this is Al Kane. I'll ask one if no one else has one. And this was not a planted question, everyone. I know the issues on the Canadian border are very different with regard to diseases of concern, ticks, etc. But is there any smuggling that goes on in a similar manner on the northern border?
Yeah, great question, Al. I think there could be. To my knowledge, I've never actually encountered one. And we've been looking for animals that, present somewhere that don't have the right paperwork, that have a story that don't really fit. But to date, I've not ever found one that has been clearly or proven to be illegally moved from the north, from Canada. But I think it's possible. Certainly it's kind of the same situation. It's a very, very long border with limited locations where we have people monitoring movement and activities. But I think it's something we should consider in the future, that is another place where movement can occur. Just the volume of movement from the south is so large that it predominates the story.
And Canadian import requirements from Europe would be more similar to ours than
Correct.
Mexico.
Yeah, and
so they would be
have...
presumably screened if they came from Europe and were headed to the US.
Correct. I will say, however, that their CEM testing, while closer to ours, is different. They don't require testing of or live cover of 2 mares for the stallions. So the live cover testing is not a part of the Canadian CEM requirements, but CEM testing is, and I believe it's probably multiple samples. So it's a better shot. It's closer to our standards for CEM, so a little bit less risk there.
All right.
Hey, Angela, I'm going to sneak in a question. Sorry, Joe. I knew you were going to cut me off, so I'm sneaking it in anyway. Angela, the question I have is most frequently asked is, have you seen an increase in the number of smuggled horses now that we have a 7-day quarantine in Mexico?
I cannot tell the difference, Katie. The volume is so large that I'm not sure we know if the 7-day quarantine has made it worse or not. I think the people who normally smuggle them are still smuggling them. I think the people who normally present them are still presenting them. So I'm not really sure, and we don't have the data to tell if there's a difference. People are angry, and I have seen a lot of people searching online and through Facebook and other places for, hey, how do I get this horse in from Mexico with no quarantine? Would they be doing that for a 3-day quarantine? Maybe. So it certainly hasn't helped matters, but it is the 7-day quarantine is appropriate for the current statuses that we're seeing in Mexico.
All right, thank you. Making sure that Dr. Sally Donata has enough time for her presentation. We're gonna move along in the agenda. Dr. Sally Donata comes from the University of Florida College of Veterinary Medicine. Go Gators! And will be talking to us on the effect of climate change on infectious disease trends in horses. Thank you, Dr. Donata, for being willing to present. That's a really cool photo. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Joe, for inviting me. Can you see my screen? Am I sharing it effectively?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right. So, yeah, thanks for having me today. I'm going to talk about some of the how climate change trends and natural disasters specifically are perhaps affecting and altering this country's horses' risk for various infectious disease in all regions of the country. This is a topic that Angela and I started talking about, I think, over wine a couple years ago at a meeting, and then we presented it at the American Horse Council and then on an AAP webinar, and it's just kind of taken off from there. And truth be told, Angela is probably the true expert on this topic, but since she's the expert on all of the topics today, I'm gonna take this one and let her have a break before she talks about CEM. I do have some slides though from Angela as well as from Mo Long. So here's what we do in Florida. We have hurricanes down here in the south. We just had a smaller version of one, of course, on Monday. And so this is a pretty not an unexpected weather pattern down where I live now in Central Florida. And we are fairly accustomed to having rather dramatic aftermath from these storms when they do hit our state or the surrounding states. But it's not just a Florida problem, and more in recent years, we've had extreme weather and natural disasters that are hitting states that had previously really not suffered from such extreme weather patterns. These are the floods in eastern Kentucky a few years ago, certainly affected a great many people. This could be in many states right now. Oregon's been on fire. That's my home state. Colorado, the Southeast, New Mexico, lots and lots of forest fires that are destroying, not only destroying property and land, but are displacing animals, which is one of the main mechanisms by which infectious disease is being affected. My home state of Oregon, we grew up without air conditioning because nobody really needed it. You could have cars without AC, you could have houses without AC. And this is Portland, Oregon in 2021, where it hit 116 degrees and people actually died in this heat wave. They had several triple-digit days again this year, and I believe they have every summer since then. This is more recently, even the really hot places are getting hotter. This is Las Vegas. They had, gosh, I think, what was it, 7 days, 10 days consecutively over 115 degrees. I believe Death Valley hit 128. So even the places that are used to extreme weather are experiencing uncomfortably extreme weather. And horse owners are cluing into this. So these are some horse owner geared periodicals that are starting to write articles about how, for owners, about how the disease risk to their individual horses may be affected by some of these natural disasters. And so as veterinarians out there, you want to be aware of the topic, which is the goal today, is really to make everybody aware of some of these trends that may be happening in the country. And then also sort of underscore the importance of veterinarians around the country and equine industry stakeholders, that you might have to have new diseases on your radar that previously had not been a problem in your region, but may be now coming to town. And there's a couple of different ways by which weather affects infectious disease in horse populations. It can affect the individual horse, or it can affect horses on a population. And in the individual, they may have increased exposure from horses being moved around. Certainly in a case if animals are evacuating, suddenly commingling, being taken off of their home property, that's going to change their risk by virtue of just contact with other horses, or perhaps contact with non-equid carrier animals for specific infectious diseases. And then we know that travel and environmental stress can affect the immune system. And so it might be that they're being exposed to new or different pathogens, or more heavy concentrations of pathogens that they have already been exposed to, and their immune system may not be particularly robust to handle that kind of an immunologic challenge. At the population risk, we have expanding vector territories in this country that have been very, very well documented, of both the flying and the crawling sort. So ticks are expanding, mosquitoes are expanding, and they're carrying their diseases with them as they migrate to new territories. And that creates an increased disease range that encroaches then in areas that were previously considered low or no risk for specific pathogens. And the most important diseases in equine populations, are core diseases for which our core vaccines are geared, are probably the most affected by the environment because they have environmental reservoirs. So the encephalitides, of course, are transmitted by mosquitoes. Rabies, the reservoir for that is wildlife. And then tetanus, the bacteria carried in soil and within the environment. And all of these, certainly the mosquito populations, wildlife populations, and environmental pathogens are all going to be affected by weather patterns. And specifically through scenarios like this, it's a little bit hard to see, but there is a horse in the middle of that. And I think it's suffice it to say his environment has some rapid changes in recent history for this guy. Luckily, he looks pretty happy and okay, but it's very it would be very common for a horse that had been in the middle of this kind of destruction to perhaps have lacerations or injuries from projectiles or debris on the ground. And this horse is not in standing water, but certainly that's something that we see post-flood a lot. But if you have lacerations like this or this nail in the foot, these horses, if they are not up to date on their tetanus vaccines within the last 6 to 12 months, then they're going to be at an increased risk for tetanus. Here you have some horses that have been just flooded onto higher ground. And this could be the result of, I mean, certainly here in Florida, this can happen just from a few days of excess rain, but this could have been in the wake of a natural disaster. A hurricane could have come through. Lots and lots of flooding in California, of course, in the last few years, I'm sure everybody's aware of. And what happens here is animals get pushed onto smaller geographic areas because the previous territories are no longer usable due to prolonged flooding. And it's not just the horses that get pushed onto smaller areas, all the wildlife, right? So a raccoon or a skunk, which may be carrying rabies, can no sooner live in the middle of this pond than any of these horses can. And so you might have more, you end up with more domestic species, wildlife species interactions. And it could be multiple species. Here's just some different scenarios of animals being sort of displaced by large amounts of standing water, like this one, because clearly these retrievers are leading the way like good dogs. But you've got cattle standing on the side of the road, unable to get across what perhaps used to be a pasture. We have horses. This was here in Florida, eating out of a canoe. And then this is a kangaroo, and I don't know what he's doing in with horses, but if they're all asked to quarantine or evacuate together, presumably these would have been from the same farm, but you've got a lot of what would be considered fairly atypical interspecies interactions. These are the rabies reservoirs. We think about bats, of course, which can fly and perhaps are less affected by things like flooding, although they can certainly have their habitats destroyed by high winds and natural disasters, certainly. But these animals are, these mammals, the raccoons, the skunks, and the foxes are going to be land-dwelling creatures that are going to be displaced right along with horses and cattle and goats and all of the other rabies susceptible species. Insects also play a pretty major role, as particularly in the post-hurricane or post-flooding period. So here in Florida, post-hurricane, we have a lot of standing water, or really anywhere that has this kind of flooding, and it's quite warm because our hurricane season is right now, and it is not cool out there right now. And so you have these huge blooms of mosquitoes, and mosquitoes carry our arboviruses, so our encephalididae, West Nile virus, and so horses are at an increased risk for exposure. And if they have not been properly vaccinated in preparation for, say, hurricane season, then you're going to have an uptick in transmission and clinical disease, not just in horses, but in people too. And this has actually been pretty well documented. This is a slide that Dr. Maureen Long of Florida, of course, an arbovirus expert, has provided for this talk. And so this is just a map of the path of Hurricane Irma, who hit in September 2017. This was before my time in Florida, but this must have been a pretty major storm because people still talk about it here. And this was not just a big storm, but it was a slow moving storm, which enabled it to dump tremendous amounts of water on the southeast and the state of Florida. And then you can see it essentially just came right up the center of the state. And here's the total rainfall in inches. This dark blue is greater than 12 inches of rain. So 12 inches in several areas along the state. So lots and lots and lots of water on the state of Florida. And this was in September, which is really kind of right at the beginning of our peak West Nile virus transmission. We tend to get Triple E in the summer, West Nile more in the fall, although we can get them. We have a pretty extended seasonal range because of our mosquito pressure here in Florida. But here is just a graph of the environmental activity and sentinel sero conversion of that year. And so you can see is the hurricane itself hit in September, so right around week 36. And the seroconversion 10-year average is this blue line here. And you can see in the wake of the storm, you've got several weeks that were well over that 10-year average. Pretty good support data to support that the standing water, the mosquito bloom, and perhaps even the movement of horses in the wake of this natural disaster of Hurricane Irma led to an increase in disease transmission. Triple E has also been on the rise, not just here in the Southeast, but particularly up north in Wisconsin and Michigan. And in 2019, so a few years after Irma, the largest number of states with equine cases, with 184 cases in 24 states. And so the actual range is spreading. Also had the highest human case count in history with 38 human cases of Triple E in 10 states. And 19 with 19 of those being fatal. And just for reference, previously, the average was around 7 human cases per year or fewer. So a huge uptick in human cases. Now, the human cases are happening independently of the equine cases. This is not a disease that can be transmitted by mosquito from horse to horse or horse to human. And so this is all related to the individual risk of getting bitten by an infected mosquito. Another way that horses can be more susceptible or have increased exposure to infectious disease is when they all get put in one place when they are trying to escape a natural disaster. And so evacuation centers, places where animals can go to shelter through a storm, if those horses have not been vaccinated adequately on their home farm in preparation, then they're going to just have a lot of additional exposure that they wouldn't have otherwise had, and potentially have a high propensity to transmit disease among horses from different properties. And I put risk-based in quotation because I think it's important now for veterinarians in this country to consider the horses that we used to perhaps pass on risk-based vaccines. So the single horse or the 2 horses that stand in a backyard, never go anywhere, never have any exposure, no plans of ever going anywhere. They previously would have been considered very low risk for things like influenza if they're not going to have any exposure to any other horses. But that horse that maybe hasn't been vaccinated for influenza for say 5 or 10 years because it's never left the backyard, if a storm comes and it's asked to evacuate, and now you put it into a shelter scenario with horses of all different immune status, different shedding status, you now have a horse that's not only susceptible to influenza, but maybe exquisitely sensitive to influenza because they actually have no vaccine history and no immunity for that pathogen at all. And so I think we might need to, my hope is that as a industry, we start to reconsider what is risk-based and take into account that horses may have unplanned movement and mingling with other horses related to weather. Strangles is a big one, of course. Anytime you have lots of horses all coming together, certainly, and if they're sharing water buckets, which is something we're always going to say we should avoid at all costs and is certainly not recommended. But again, sometimes in these scenarios where you have a hurricane coming, you've got to do what you've got to do, and horses may be sharing water sources. So preventing diseases like strangles, flu, herpes, all really important. You could talk a whole hour on what ticks are doing in this country. The ticks are on the move. This is not just a problem in the mountains and in the Northeast. This is a picture of 1996 to 2018, the expansion of Lyme disease via the Ixodes tick in the Northeast. And so you can see in 1896. It was really quite a small area. This Lyme disease got its name from Old Lyme, Connecticut, which are where it was first discovered. And you can see by 2018, it had expanded out throughout Pennsylvania, New York, and then certainly out east as well. And so these ticks are moving, and they take whatever disease they may be carrying or pathogen with them. And if you are watching this and thinking, well, I'm not really in an area that has a lot of mosquitoes, we have nice hard frosts, and I'm not in an area that has ticks. Well, you might want to think again, because there are vector-borne diseases everywhere. So you can see, even if you're in a state that is in this kind of tan color, of which there really aren't that many, there are still up to 500 vector-borne diseases reported over this. I guess it's a pretty big range, but fourth 20% quartile, but the top 20% being down here in the south, and these are mosquitoes, so that makes sense. We've got lots of mosquitoes down here because we don't get hard freezes, and it tends to be kind of warm and wet most of the year. It's a little bit different for the tick-borne diseases, so top 20% up more northern territories. But really, so none is white, and there are actually no white states at all. So nowhere in this country can you be totally free from any vector-borne diseases of importance. The effects of climate may also be indirect. So it might not be that the weather change delivers a new disease to your area. It might be that horses become more susceptible to diseases that are already there. And this is a pretty interesting example. This is in 2021 in Canyon City, Colorado. These were horses, of course, that Angela dealt with certainly directly. This is about 2,500 BLM horses that underwent an emergency roundup due to a wildfire. And there was a herd from West Douglas that arrived at the BLM holding center that had had severe smoke inhalation from proximity to the fire prior to being rounded up and moving. And this herd was behaviorally a little bit unique. The individuals were reported to have never really settled into captivity. They seemed to be undergoing kind of ongoing stress. They were just a bit more wild than what is typical for those herds in that scenario. And so a combination of them being more stressed, a bit harder to handle or manage, and then short staffing at the facility, they really didn't get handled, and they didn't undergo the typical vaccine protocol when they arrived at the BLM facility. Then they had an outbreak of respiratory disease, and multiple horses were dying. And many of you probably saw the news reports that were coming out while all this was happening. There was certainly, anytime you have an outbreak like that, people thought that some superbug was maybe coming through. Perhaps this was a new pathogen. Lots of interest to figure out what was killing these BLM horses. And as it turns out, the necropsies confirmed that it was pretty garden variety influenza with secondary bronchopneumonia. So a disease process that we see in horse populations with fairly routinely. And so the question then became, well, why is flu killing all these horses when we consider it a fairly survivable disease in most populations? And this was not a small number of horses. They lost about 145 horses, and all were from that specific herd. And in the end, the theory is that they had actually had damage to their lungs from smoke injury, plus the stress of movement, plus inadequate vaccination that actually led them to be much more susceptible to severe, fatal, life-threatening disease from influenza and then subsequent bacterial pneumonia. And so this is an example of how an environmental pressure or injury made them more susceptible to a disease that perhaps they could have handled with less. They may have had a high morbidity. Certainly we know that influenza is highly infectious in all populations of unvaccinated equids, but perhaps the mortality would have been expected to have been much lower. And some of the infectious diseases that come from natural disasters are not contagious. These are environmental diseases. And so these are all horses that have pretty severe contact dermatitis from prolonged water exposure and a breakdown of that skin barrier. We take our skin for granted, but it's a really important component of our immune system. It protects you from all of the bad bugs that are swirling around us all the time. And water really does a number on the natural barrier of the skin and the natural integrity of the skin. And so these horses all had essentially scald from standing water. And there are some really nasty bugs, as you can imagine, that start circulating when you have flooding and standing water, from everything from septic overflow to yeah, all kinds of nasty stuff in those waters. And so this, if you have a breakdown of these skin barriers, these horses can actually end up with essentially a biologic conduit right into their bloodstream. And I've seen horses become bacteremic from standing in mud for prolonged periods of time, and ending up with mud scald and direct translocation of bacteria actually into their bloodstream. Sometimes diseases can hitch rides and travel in feed sources. So in 2000, this is a map from 2022, in 2022, we had some pretty widespread droughts across the country, with approximately 45% of the acreage in this country experiencing a drought, which dramatically affected the way that hay of all kinds, grass hays, alfalfas, other legumes, were grown, harvested, and where they ended up, where to what states they were transported in order to meet the supply of local horses and livestock. And you can see here the drought area is all this orange, and major hay areas are the dark green. So you have some pretty large areas affected by drought. And in that year, a fairly large amount of alfalfa was being moved, typically comes from out west and is brought east. But there were a few focal sources that ended up in really high concentrations in Florida. And one of those batches of alfalfa was carrying botulism with it. So botulism is a disease that we don't see very often in Florida, certainly not endemic like up in the Northeast or in the Kentucky region. And that would be the type B. We think that these horses probably had type C from a dead animal being baled into, or several dead animals being baled into this alfalfa. But this was an outbreak here in Central Florida that Joe Fish, of course, Dr. Fish and his team helped us work up. But in the end, I believe the estimated fatality was somewhere between 10 and 20 horses. Because we don't see it very often in Florida, this and one of the clinical signs of botulism is just finding a horse dead. There are probably a few horses that went undiagnosed, but these are horses that made it into our clinic. It's pretty typical neuromuscular paralysis associated with botulism. Many of you have probably seen this. This is the picture seen around the world. This is the big alfalfa bale, the big block hay that has the deer limb in it. And certainly something like this could release or could be carrying botulism type C toxin. And if there were several of these animals, or if they got chopped up by a large sort of combine style hay machinery, then you could have body parts in multiple areas of multiple bales and have an outbreak like we did. So lots of different ways that our changing world is going to change the way that horses are exposed to and susceptible to diseases. What can we do as the equine industry to protect them? So be vigilant with core and risk-based vaccines, and reconsider what is risk-based, not risk-based, but reconsider what is risk-based. So I think we need to consider a risk being that horses are going to need to move and commingle. And and given that, there's probably very few horses out there that shouldn't be getting EHV influenza vaccines fairly routinely. Groups like the AAP, the EDCC, the AHC need to work together to make sure that their membership, that we're continuing to kind of ring the bell that horses need to be vaccinated, because preventing many of these diseases can become very straightforward as long as horses are being vaccinated according to the AAP guidelines. Thankfully, the AVMA, just in the last year or two now, I guess, has added horses to their recommended species for rabies vaccines. Believe it or not, previously it had been just cats, dogs, and ferrets, and now horses have been added to that list. So hopefully that will help increase compliance. Help clients and local equine groups plan for unintended disasters, hurricanes, flooding, fires, make sure that people have good first aid kits, they have good communication with their vets, they have veterinarians. That's step one, is to make sure everybody's engaged with a local equine veterinarian, and that they have a plan should they suddenly need to move. And then finally, educating the healthcare professionals, so state animal health officials, veterinarians, barn managers, anybody related to healthcare in the industry might need additional or to seek out additional information about diseases that previously had not really been on their radar. Certainly as a veterinarian, I don't know a lot about the diseases that exist in places where I've never practiced, and that's, I think, pretty typical. But as diseases are moving regionally, we might need to double down on our things like veterinary CE, public service announcements, state animal health official information that gets disseminated through the regulatory veterinarians to help make sure that people are aware of the disease and can recognize them early, treat them appropriately when they do see them for the first time. And that's all I've got. Happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Donata. I have a question because as part of hurricane response for Debbie, how long, and we're expecting possibly more flooding, how long does the horse or animal need exposure to that water to give you the clinical signs that you showed on those pictures? And how long before you start getting like even moderate signs?
So my experience is actually from Oregon, where we have lots of flooding and mud as well. But I have seen horses lose their hair and have scald with 24 hours in standing water, especially if it's warm and dirty. And all it takes is a simple a laceration or an excoriation on the skin, and that area will become, will break down even more quickly. So I would imagine that water in the Northwest is similar to water here in Florida, but it can happen really quickly. I don't know. I didn't take the photos. Those were from Florida disasters before my time in this state. So I don't know how long each of those horses had been standing, but and especially too, if they're struggling in any way. We used to have horses that would get stuck in kind of mud quicksand. Those horses are moving around, and so they're essentially exfoliating their skin and their hair coat off as they're trying to get out of these muddy water holes quickly. The answer is quickly, though.
Appreciate that. Really great presentation. Unless somebody has like an awesome question, I'm going to give you like 15 seconds for it. And then otherwise we're going to be forced to move on. And respecting everybody's time, I'm going to try and cut this a little bit short and not read the background. But anybody have any questions for Donata? All right, you're off the hook. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Again, trying to respect everybody's time. We do have 2 resolutions. If somebody will let me know that you can see the screen, it should say Committee on Equine is the source, point of care testing, or a thumbs up.
Yep, we see it.
Perfect, thank you. I did provide these, and Katie did for the other membership. It is in Word, so if you have recommendations to it, if you would submit those to me and do those edits and track changes, and they will be highly considered. So point of care testing, I assume most people are up to date on it. If not, I'll take a question afterwards. But the resolution reads as it currently stands. This is draft. The United States Animal Health Association Committee on Equine urges the United States Department of Agriculture Center for Veterinary Biologics to require point of care test or testing for a USDA national list of reportable animal disease listed disease to be restricted for sale and use by licensed and accredited veterinarian. Furthermore, USAHA COE urges USDA veterinary services and/or state animal health officials to establish compliance and enforcement protocols and procedures to ensure timely reporting of a suspected regulatory disease regardless of testing results from point of care testing. Part of that, if you're thinking that it could be enough to test for it, I have on a point of care testing machine here in Florida, we have multiple that have been reported negative on the point of care testing when shipped to another lab that is not just our state lab, but other reference laboratories, they have returned positive. From a disease aspect, I know that they're getting the clients are wanting that information, but it also leads to if you're not able to enforce the animals staying there, you're actually doing a larger disservice to the community by spreading all of those exposed animals out into all sorts of places. So that's the reason for that resolution. Guess I will read the next one and then we can take comments on both. That seems kind of kamikaze style, but or anybody can talk to me afterwards and I'd be happy to talk with them about either or both of these resolutions. So the second resolution is titled Request for USDA to review of equine import export. So USDA COE requests USDA APHIS Veterinary Services to conduct a thorough and comprehensive workforce and program review of import-export services related to equids and equine products. USAHA COE further encourages the review team to seek assistance on the review process from subject matter experts such as representatives from USAHA COE, the American Association of Veterinary Laboratory Diagnosticians, National Animal Health Laboratory Network Laboratories, National Assembly of Animal Health Officials, American Horse Council, AAEP, Infectious Diseases Committee, United States Equine Federation, Jockey Club, American Quarter Horse Association, national or international national transporters, brokers, and academia, specifically subject matter experts on equine foreign animal diseases and equine diagnostic testing. So just a little bit of background for those that aren't familiar with the resolution process. These are presented to primarily USDA, but also to state animal health officials and others as USAHA is looked to as a known source of common thought and expertise. In previous, we had a resolution for microchipping of equids, and the AAP recently produced a position statement supporting microchips. I won't go into that very much, but these resolutions do have impact. So if you are not a member of the Committee on Equine, but part of USAHA and are interested, please join. If you already are on COE and have input on these, I'm happy to discuss now or happy to take comments offline. Okay. If you are hanging on because you wanted to hear a update from Florida on the contagious equine metritis situation. So since we last talked, we have had a few more geldings that have become positive, that have tested positive. They were already positive, but they've tested positive. So now we have 14 total positive ponies. So that's 2 stallions, 1 mare, and 11 geldings. We still think that all of those are from the same process where they were cleaning their sheath cleaning practices. They are linked in that way whenever doing genetic testing. The one mare that was positive has undergone her treatment and has completed her test out. So that's good. 2 of the contact or possible trace stallions still within all the same herd have tested negative. We are working on the post-treatment samples for the 2 confirmed positive. So the post-treatment culturing, again, we've had a little bit of overgrowth issues. So working to do that before they can be bred, working to get those sets of cultures that are negative. As they've had a number of ponies that have tested positive, and with the records and what they would indicate, we have also opened or increased the scope, still on the same premises. But we are looking at all the geldings, well, all the horses on the property now. So there are also all geldings, 40 additional saddle horses, and 22 additional draft horses that will be or currently undergoing testing. Again, that's all going to still be linked to the same sheath cleaning techniques. I think that is a relatively brief and concise update. Angela may have something to add in case I forgot something.
No, Joe, I just posted in the chat the link to the USDA website where we're posting these updates. So you can go and get more details about the current update that Joe just provided. And every time we update that site, we push it out through EDCC as well. So the Equine Disease Communication Center, if you're signed up for alerts, will tell you when to go look for updated information posted to the USDA CEM page. So you can follow along there.
Awesome, thanks. Any questions from anybody on related to the last 3 topics? All right, thanks for hanging in there with us. We appreciate you. Sorry we pushed 8 minutes of overtime, but appreciate y'all hanging in there. Have a great day.